So welcome to those of you who just joined. We're going to probably give it another minute or so, just so we can let other attendees join. Hope everybody's doing well. All right, I think we can get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Information and Adult Services, and on behalf of the Ferguson Library, welcome. Tonight we have a very special event. Author, journalist, and poet Michael Harriot will be discussing his new book, Black AF History, The Un-Whitewashed Story of America, which we just learned is number 7 on the New York Times list. Before we start, I'd just like to ask that if you have any questions for our guests this evening, you use that Q&A feature. It's located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them. Our moderator, Alvin Hall, is an award-winning journalist, radio broadcaster, and author of Driving the Green Book, a road trip through the living history of Black resistance. Our special guest, Michael Harriot, is a critically acclaimed author, poet, journalist, and broadcaster. He is a columnist at thedegrio.com, where he covers the intersection of race, politics, and culture. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, NBC, BET, and on his mother's refrigerator. He is a political commentator on MSNBC and CNN and has been honored by the National Association of Black Journalists for the commentary, digital commentary, and TV news writing. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us this evening.
You're welcome. Thank you, Anthony. Michael, it's very exciting to interview you tonight and to talk about this amazing book. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, so the book was not planned. I had originally, so I am by trade, I would guess, an economist. And so I taught for years a class called Race as an Economic Construct. So trying to understand both the concept of race and the principles, the fundamental principles of economics through supply and demand and kind of a factual mathematical basis instead of like theory and history. And so I presented a proposal for a book called White Peopleology. And everyone loved it and everyone wanted to buy it. But every time I went to a publisher, they'd ask me, but what about that history thing you do on Twitter? Mm-hmm. So the one book proposal became 2 books. Well, the reason I did the history book first was this was pitched in 2018, and all of the publishers were adamant that the subtitle of the White Peopleology book, no one would know what it meant because it was a subject that I studied, but they said no one else had ever heard of it, and they don't know how anybody would ever know about it. And the subtitle was Toward a More Critical Race Theory. And they insisted that no one had ever heard of this critical race theory thing back then. And like, it would be too arcane to come out with it as a first book. So Black AF History was flip-flopped as the first book.
The most amazing thing about the book is the sweep of history you take in this book. You go from the 16th century to contemporary events, and it's all documented with footnotes. Where did you find the time?
So one of the things I wanted to do was, again, to cover, the history, but I didn't want to do it broadly. So I wanted to go in depth and cover a large span of history. So what I did is I learned about this thing called biphasic sleep. So apparently for most of human history, people have always slept in 2 cycles. We would go to sleep when the sun came down because there were no electric lights. You got to save that candle wax. And so they would go to sleep when the sun went down, wake up in the middle of the night, and that's when they would read the Bible, to be frank, make other people, feed the animals because the animals would be asleep. It's easier to milk a cow, apparently. This is what I've heard, when they're asleep. So that's when they would do that. And then that was called the witching hour. They would go back to sleep and wake up when the sun came up. And I tried it, And I got on a biphasic sleep cycle, and you'd sleep 3 hour increments. So I'd go to sleep at like 8, wake up around 11, 12, and write, and then go back to sleep about 3 o'clock in the morning and wake up around 6, 7 o'clock.
That's amazing. I do that a lot as a writer. My best ideas often come to me around 3:15 in the morning, and I get up and I start writing them, and they're there, and then I go back to bed and I wake up and I can read the richness of the idea. So that gave you a lot of time, a lot of what I call quiet time to write. One of the first things that struck me about your book is the fact that you weave the personal story with your own family into the history and how you started learning much of this information. You were homeschooled, and your mother was very strict with you, wasn't she?
Yes, she was very strict. I didn't think so then, because how you grow up is always normal to each and every individual. But I realized later that, yeah, she was pretty strict. My sisters used to say, well, we know, because my sisters' rooms were painted pink. And so they would say, we never get to leave out of these pink walls. And so, yeah, she was pretty strict on us.
When I told somebody I was interviewing you, he said to me that what he had learned was in school about Black history was Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Sojourner Truth, maybe Malcolm X, maybe W.E.B. Du Bois. But your mother made sure you were grounded in it quite in depth, didn't she?
Yeah, and like part of that story that you talked about earlier, my family story, she made sure we learned that and knew that the past was important. And as far as our education was concerned, it was largely self-directed. And it was interesting to me to juxtapose that with when I started going to public schools and how divided our learning is. So to me, when I was growing up, there was no difference between language arts and history or science and math. It was all the same subject, the progress and the experience of learning and acquiring knowledge. And so when you read a history book, it was also a language arts thing. It's also how you learn words and vocabulary words. And when you learned science, you also had to learn math. And my mother was adamant about that. And she was adamant about having us learn. And I don't even know, well, I say adamant, but she wasn't really, like, I never got the sense that she was teaching us an alternative version of history that you would never forget in case somebody tries to take it from you. She just said, well, learning about the past is important because it's like, how do you know where you are? If you're going, she used to say, if you're going on a journey and you didn't know how you got there, then how would you know where you're going? And so it was in that context that I learned history. This is as important as chemistry and science and your multiplication tables, and it was part of the learning process.
And you lay the history that you've learned over American history. So recently, because of the book 1619, we've all come to believe that the first African Americans came to this country in 1619, but you discovered that there were others who came before.
Right. The first Africans in America came before, nearly a century before 1619. The first documented was a man named Juan Garrido, who stepped foot on the North American continent with Ponce de Leon in 1525. And he went on to help conquer much of the North American continent as a Spanish conquistador. He was a free Black man who somehow became a conquistador. He was a West African prince. He was the first person to sow wheat in the Americas that we know of. And so he was here nearly a century. Then we see the Aeon expedition, when they brought enslaved Africans here. The first slave revolt, 1526, was, again, nearly a century before. And the Europeans left, and they left the enslaved Africans here to be with the natives. And then we saw a man called Mustafa Azamuri. He was known as Esteban the Moor, who was enslaved and traveled from South Carolina to the Florida Panhandle, Galveston, Texas, and was the first non-native to cross the Sierra Madres, and saw probably more of this continent than probably any human being before him, because he traveled most of North America. And it's interesting that the Pueblo people, in their oral history, they always say that the first white man we saw was a Black man, and they were talking about Mustafa Azamuri.
That's amazing to me, because this is a whole history that we did not know until your book. And the way you write about it is so compelling, the way you give it the proper historical context. After this period, when white people came and began to settle in America, in particular along the East Coast in various cities, 3 cities stand out in your book as really remarkable places for the development of white supremacy. They are Charleston, the other state is Richmond, and the other one is Louisiana. Could you talk about each of those states and why they are so seminal to the history that you're talking about?
Right. And so one of the fundamental premises of this book is that if there is such a thing as Black America, then its capital is South Carolina, specifically Charleston. And it's a premise that I've been teaching and talking about and writing about for years. So 40% of the enslaved Africans who ever arrived in America arrived in Charleston, came through Charleston. If you just count the people who were once in Charleston, stopped there, it's up to 90%. So it's really the capital of America. It was called the slave capital of the New World. Richmond, of course, because those were the first Africans to arrive with the English settlers. And then Louisiana is a very interesting story, because we rarely talk about it in the context of America. And one of the things I wanted to do was talk about these places, because when we talk about early America, we usually view it through like Boston, New York, and the East Coast, Massachusetts, those 3 areas, right? And so what I wanted to do is recenter the world in Blackness. Well, I do a whole chapter on the Haitian slave revolt, right? Which is the largest revolt of enslaved people in the history of the world. But what I talk about, the reason that's important to American history is because of the consternation it caused in the Americas, and the fact that the French got out of the slavery game and sold what we call the Louisiana Purchase to America, doubling the size of the United States because of that. But between the time of that revolt and the Louisiana Purchase, that area belonged to France, and those free enslaved Africans in Haiti, that was they were French citizens, so they could go to Louisiana. So that's why we have that. Louisiana has such a big diaspora of people, of Haitians, free people of color, enslaved people, and many of them don't descend from people who were enslaved by Americans, but by French. And it's a really interesting state, and not to mention, for instance, that those free people of color will actually, challenge the status quo and the racial hierarchy in what became known as Plessy versus Ferguson, or separate but equal. And that was the court case was bought by free people of color in Louisiana. So it's a very interesting thing to look at America, to have America's center viewed from a different perspective than where the white people were.
Exactly. And especially in these states, because these states became very skillful at creating the first examples of Black codes. For example, I think as I remember, Virginia passed the first law that made slavery in perpetuity. If you were born in slavery and your mother was a slave, then you would be a slave. And the other one was that after revolts in Charleston, the state passed a law that all white people had to have guns. I never knew that before. I find those types of things amazing. So a lot of what happened in these states were driven by fear, because often there were more African Americans or enslaved people there than there were white people.
Yeah, that's another thing that we don't talk about. in history, and especially in elementary school social studies classes, we never talk about Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina being states where Black people were the majority. South Carolina was a majority Black state until the 1930 census. And so that Black majority, you just think about it, to rule over a Black majority with such a limited number of people takes a very brutal system that instills fear to extract labor and intellectual property using violence or the threat of violence. And that's partly why, when telling this story, you have to understand, because, we've all heard the thing that, well, slavery existed in every society in history. And what I point out in the book is that these systems enabled a society that was built off slavery in a much different way. First of all, it was color-based. Secondly, it was, inheritable and inescapable, right? Like if you were enslaved, that meant your children were enslaved. And the most interesting part about this is American-style slavery was different in that it reduced the human beings to chattel. So even after America was formed, there was a loophole that allowed cities and states to enact these brutal laws, because they were laws about property and not laws about crime, right? So the laws that governed enslaved people were property laws, which is a very important thing to recognize when you're talking about that idea of enslaving people, because unlike all of the history that came before it, the American-style slavery was not, we use the word slavery, right, which is a too broad a term, because it can include a woman who was in a forced marriage. It could include indentured servitude. It could include peonage. It can include unpaid labor. What we're talking about is race-based, inescapable, a system of human trafficking that reduced human being to chattel for the benefit of white people, not the majority, not the greater part of society, but for white people, right? And that is a very different thing. And the other thing that is unique to American style slavery is that the people involved, the enslaved people, unlike all of the things, they were not prisoners of war. They were not, living in places that were involved in territorial or political conflicts. They were just free people who were subjected to this international human trafficking system for the benefit of white people.
Yes. It is amazing that throughout the book, you find all these documents and you quote them of people talking about maintaining white supremacy, that it's a divine right, that it is the natural order of things. I mean, it was like a wave after wave, and it never diminished. That's the thing that is most amazing about your book, that it never diminishes. But at the same time, it seems that within each group of African American, someone rises up to resist. And that person is so well respected. In your book, you write about Forrest Joe. Could you tell us about him?
Yeah, so, we've heard stories about the Underground Railroad, but what I wanted to do is talk about the idea of maroonage. So most of the people who escaped enslavement did not travel north. Most of them stayed in the same areas. They just basically hid from white people. And Forrest Joe was one of these people who from 1821 to 1823 became almost a legendary superhero in the coastal region of South Carolina and Georgia. So he escaped and he started freeing other enslaved people. He would conduct these midnight raids where he would alleviate people of their property and their livestock and their enslaved property too. And what was interesting about Forrest Joe is because as his legend grew, he was able to create an intelligent network of enslaved people who might not escape with him, but they would tip him off and give him information or misdirect the people who were looking for him. And so we scoured newspapers and articles to find all of these people talking about this one guy. And what was the result was he was eventually killed. His maroon village was eventually attacked. And the way they did it was, again, another part of whitewashed history. We are always taught that the first police force in America was created in Boston, but the first police force in America was created to catch a maroon named Forrest Joe, and they were called the Pineville Police Association. And they passed a law to divert money for the Pineville Municipal Police Association to catch specifically Forrest Joe.
Yes, that along with the Sugar House in Charleston was the other thing that amazed me. I did not know about the Sugar House at all. And as I learned about it, it was a place where they took African Americans who were out of line, so to speak, or who were being who seemed to be too rebellious. And what would happen in the Sugar House?
Well, so the Sugar House was, they hired trained. It was a municipally funded place where they hired trained people to discipline your slaves. So you send your enslaved people there, whether it was for a week or a few days, and they would send them back, promising that they would be more docile. And the slave owners would pay these, government slave traders to, make the slaves docile. Now, why is this important? Because this is a society built on slavery. So this was in Charleston that had the highest per capita income in the colonies before the American Revolution. So this is how, but because they were the minority, remember, this is how they reinforced and kept and protected that wealth through brutality, through violence. And because when you are a small minority of people, again, you have to not just instill rules, you have to make the people who you intend to follow those rules afraid of what will happen if they don't. And you have to do that by instilling fear and violence. And we saw that, and that was the rise of, it was simultaneously paralleled the rise of the American carceral system. And that's how we created the American penal system.
Yes, and this Sugar House eventually became, I think, the Citadel, because it was changed to the name of the Center of Corrections, and that became the Citadel eventually. Am I correct?
Right. Yeah. So after it was like it was an old sugar place, so it was colloquially called the Sugar House, but the people who actually manned the Sugar House worked for this uniquely American creation called a Department of Corrections. And that's where that name comes from.
Yep, and that eventually evolved into the Citadel. It's that type of money-making venture that we don't think about, that this became a huge moneymaker for the city of Charleston. The other story that amazed me, and I think this dealt with me with food, which is very important to me. Growing up as a child, as I did in Northern Florida, we'd have potato salad at every meal and all of that. But I never really liked potatoes that well. I was a rice kid, and I still love rice. And every time we'd go to visit my aunt and uncle in Lake City, Florida, she'd always have a big pot of chicken and rice on the stove. So I learned from your book of the importance first of rice in the economy of America. We always think about cotton, but the story of rice is quite powerful. Could you tell us about that?
Right. So rice played a number of important roles in the development of America, and especially the development of Black America. So unlike Virginia's, Charleston in South Carolina was a pre-planned development. Slavery was written into the Constitution, and the constitutions of Carolina said every free man or every white person will have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of any character whatsoever. So South Carolina was built on white supremacy. But it was not people from England who first populated Charleston in South Carolina. It was people who had already, rich people, aristocrats who had already had plantations in the Caribbean. And they thought they'd be able to come to Charleston because it had the same climate and have citrus farms. And they realized, well, citrus wouldn't grow here because of the soil. Then they tried silkworms and they tried everything and it wouldn't grow. But they'd already imported their enslaved people, and they realized that the enslaved people weren't starving, and they wondered why. And they realized, oh, they were growing their own rice. So Charleston and South Carolinians immediately went to what became known as the Rice Coast or the Gold Coast, and got the Africans who knew how to grow and harvest, and they were agricultural experts and horticulturalists who knew this system. And this interesting thing about that was, I was hired once to write a article on the plantation tourism industry in South Carolina. And I visited this plantation, and it was right after the area experienced what was called the 100-year flood. And one of the visitors on the plantation tour asked, how did they escape this 100-year flood? They were at the nexus of the Stono River and the Atlantic Ocean. And they said, well, the bridges and the levees and the dams that were built by the Africans 300 years ago, they still work. And so when we knew the storm was coming, we would actually flood the area surrounding the plantation. And then when the waters receded, we would pull back the levees. And so this system, these engineers, these horticulturalists, these agricultural engineers taught Americans how to create the first edible cash crop in these colonies. And it's what built South Carolina. And not just what built South Carolina. The interesting thing about it is that in the parts of Africa where they had this rice knowledge, the women were the rice growers and they made the tools. And so before South Carolina, because they were such huge importers of enslaved people, before then, the male to female ratio was about like 1.75 men for every woman. And because they went to get these women rice growers, it evened the male to female ratio in the slave population in America. And again, rice is very important to the development of the Southern economy and to South Carolina and to America as a whole.
And it's important to you because throughout the book, you have this ongoing competition between two rice dishes that you love and you know well. And what are those?
Yeah, so this is like, if you've ever heard of the Jollof wars between Ghanaians and Nigerians, between who makes the best jollof. Well, in South Carolina, there's this war between chicken bog and rice perlo, or what we call just perlo.
Yes.
And a bog is different from a perlo. So depending on which part of the Geechee Gullah culture you're from, you might be perlo people, or so my grandfather's, my mother's side of my grandparents' family was bog people. And they were enslaved in Sumter, South Carolina, along the upper coast of South Carolina. But my low country family on my paternal grandmother's side, they were perlo people. So perlo and bog is like a big war in South Carolina. And depending on where you go, you might eat perlo or bog, and they're kind of similar. They're rice-based dishes. They include meats and vegetables, and there's like a meal in and of themselves. But there's a very particular war, and you can't call a bog a perlo, and it's not some chicken bog or chicken bog. It's a bog. Like the whole dish is one thing. Like, A Tribe Called Quest, or An America. It's a bog.
Exactly. When I was reading that part of the book, I was having this wonderful fantasy of trying to figure out whether my aunt made a bog or a perlo. I think she made a bog because it had that sort of flavor to it.
Yeah, she probably made a bog.
Exactly. So, and this brings me to the point of talking about your own family and their experiences. There's an amazing story you tell about your Uncle James, your grandfather James, whose name was Buck, and the fact that he had a taxi service that he ran out of a room that he had built onto the back of the house. with this room in between. And he would pick up black people, in white neighborhoods at night. And the town didn't like that. And it's at the end of that story that you recall asking your grandmother a question. And I'd like for you to tell the listeners that story.
Sure. So, one night, some armed white posse burst onto that back part of the house to attack my grandfather. And he ran from that back, closed the door that led to the rest of the house, and put all the children in the bathtub. And him and my grandmother stood at the door guarding that door with their guns and shot through the door. And so all of my life growing up, we still have that same door with the same bullet holes. And people for generations would come and sign that door. And so I'd always thought that like somebody might have kicked the door, they were moving something and dinged the door, because it was like an old hollow core door that was like made of pressed wood. It was really thin wood. And so I asked my grandmother about it, and she told me the story about when that armed posse came looking for my grandmother. And I was like, well, do you think they were there to just scare y'all? Or do you think they were going to do something else? And she looked at me and she said, something else. And I always remember that. And to me, that's what the Reconstruction period was for a lot of Black people. It was something else.
Yep. And you mine that beautiful story and that theme of something else throughout the book in such a beautiful, rich way. I read those sections multiple times where something else would come up. And it was always a point where you had to stop and think, what was the intent of the people at that time? Another another thing you do that's very personal is you write a letter to a guy you grew up with who was like your brother. His name was Tyron, and he's in prison. And that is the most beautiful letter. It's personally my favorite chapter in the book because of how lyrical your language is and how both touching and intimate it is for your past, but also you then zoom out to look at what all of this means to both you who are outside of prison and Tyron who is in prison. How did you?
Yeah, and so I wanted to tell the history of the American carceral system, from slave catchers to what it evolved into. And I also wanted to talk about how the arbitrary subjectiveness of life in America for Black people. So Tyron and I, our mothers were sisters, the two youngest of nine. They were the two youngest of nine. And they were, I mean, they used to call my mom and his mom Frick and Frack. They always lived next door to each other for all of their lives. And so Tyron and I were always together for most of our young lives. We had the same upbringing, and how we diverged, I talk about that, and how America plays a part in that. But I start with a summer when we were hanging out at one of our aunt's house for the summer, and it was all the male cousins. And my Aunt Janie, who was the aunt that we were staying with, she gave us everything. We could go to the store and buy as many popsicles we want. I was saying yesterday that we had to have eaten we discovered cinnamon toast, how to make cinnamon toast. We had to eat a loaf of bread a day and just cinnamon toast. And she bought us boxing gloves and we would fight. And she put a basketball hoop inside the house. And at the end of the summer, my Uncle Rob lived like in the next town over. And my Aunt Janie didn't have HBO and he had HBO. So we wanted to see this movie called Clash of the Titans. So we ran away from the house that had everything. And my Aunt Jane was like, I don't understand how I gave y'all everything and y'all still ran away. How could you run away from the Cinnamon Toast Crunch, boxing gloves, inside basketball house? And my cousin said, yeah, we was free, but we wasn't all the way free, right? because that was also the summer that the crack epidemic was exploding. So she put all of that stuff in the house to keep an eye on us, right? And I use that theme of all the way free to explain the American carceral system, right? Like, it is America, it can be simultaneously a country where freedom exists, but we ain't never been all the way free. So the generation after enslavement, they might have had it better than everyone else in America, every Black person in the history of America, but they weren't all the way free. And then the next Jim Crow generation, they had it better than the slaves, but they weren't all the way free. And then the generation after Jim Crow that didn't have to go to segregated schools, but our schools are still underfunded. Black neighborhoods still exist. The carceral system still disproportionately targets Black men. And we are free, but we ain't all the way free. And then I want to juxtapose that to talk about the idea of freedom and the gradation of it and the progress and the work that we have to do.
And there were so many people who've done work leading up to this point. You have 2 chapters specifically talking about women who have been leaders in reparations, women who have who started the civil rights movement. Those chapters are rich because some of those names I don't think we know. I grew up in near Tallahassee, Florida, so I knew about Mary McLeod Bethune, but others of them I did not know. The same thing with men you talk about in the book that people may not know. Yes, we know Frederick Douglass, we know Du Bois, but there are other men who were really central to helping us move forward, helping us to challenge the system. And a lot of these people were much more successful than history would let us know.
Right. And the important thing is, we've talked before, and in those conversations, we always, you maybe laugh once you talked about, like, because every white person and Black person has that same story about they learn like 4 Black people in their social studies class. Like, it's always Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, and then you just get to pick a 4th one. Sometimes it's Sojourner Truth, sometimes it's Mary McLeod Bethune, but it's like 3 people and a possible. It's like a decent hand in spades, right? And what I want to do is to tell and elevate the names of some of those names that you haven't heard about. Names like Moses Dixon, names like Ella Baker, names like Mary Ellen Pleasant. And then I also wanted to take the names that we all already know and tell the part of their stories that we never talk about, right? So we don't talk about Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad. We talk about her as a spy, as a military leader, right? And we don't talk about people like Martin Luther King as a protest leader, right? We talk about his economic ideas, right? And then we talk about when we talk about the civil rights movement, we don't talk about nonviolent resistance because we learn enough about that. We talk about armed resistance. We talk about the people who had to protect themselves, who took guns to protect themselves, and how they protected themselves from the violence that America enacts upon Black people. And I think those stories are important. One of my favorites is the story of Moses Dixon, who planned a national state slave revolt. And they picked a day, and he had a secret society of 12 men in states across the country that had 200,000 enslaved people that was going to march toward Atlanta on a specific date. And just so happens that the Civil War starts before the day that they picked happened. Well, in 50 years, that group had 100,000 people in a secret fraternity that were members of the Taborian Society. And they took those dues and built the first Black-owned hospital in a Black town, the Taborian Hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And that specific hospital is so important to Black history, but we never talk about it. It's where a little guy named skinny Army veteran named Medgar Evers learned how to canvass door to door. It's where many of the civil rights leaders were born. It's where a little guy named Jesse Jackson learned how to go door to door canvassing as an insurance salesman for the Taborian Hospital. It's how we know what happened to Emmett Till, because when the Black journalists came to Mississippi, they stayed at the armed compound of TRM Howard, who was the chief surgeon at the Mound Bayou Hospital. So these stories, like TRM Howard tells one of his young preachers, hey, let that girl sing, even though she's pregnant. Let her sing at this civil rights rally. And that little girl sang, and people noticed her, and her name is Aretha Franklin, right? So these stories that are tied together throughout history that are never told, I wanted to elevate those stories, both of the untold name, the unnamed names, and the untold parts of the stories for the names that we do know.
Yes. And you also look to the future of the society at large. You have 2 chapters where you have a Q&A with a racist baby. They are really quite funny, especially the one on reparations, which he first thinks about is revelations, because all the Black people are going to go up to heaven. It's so interesting. But what you capture very wittily in those chapters is what I call deliberate white blindness. You use this baby in which white people don't want to learn certain things or want to admit it, so they use other words to get around it. Those chapters are really excellent. How did you come up with that construct?
So there is a Reddit thread, part of Reddit called ELI5, explain like I'm a 5-year-old. So Racist Baby started out as me explaining simple concepts that all Black people seem to understand to white people. So I would explain it like they were a racist 5-year-old. And so I've been doing that for years, and it became one of my editor's favorite kind of recurring characters. And she would say, you should do this with Racist Baby, right? And so the first time I did it was to explain to people that concept of, you've heard this a million times. Well, the Democrats was the real racist. And to explain the party shift, and I do it in the book that way too. But I wanted to break down these concepts and to explain not only how like facile and flattened those conversations have become and unnuanced, and that you have to understand, they're so simplified. And I also wanted people to know and to understand how these things are perpetuated. So even though we call him Racist Baby isn't racist. He's a baby who have racist parents. And so Racist Baby was like, yeah, but I learned that at the marshmallow roast with, when you always have that bonfire with the lowercase t, and I'm, no, Racist Baby, that's a cross burning, and that's not your choir robe, that's a Klan robe that you're wearing. And so Racist Baby, we see him inheriting and being taught the bigotry of his parents. And I'm his friend that he secretly comes to and asks if, hey, this stuff that my mom say, is that correct? And I have to explain it to the Racist Baby.
It's so brilliant. It's often both sort of heartrending and funny at the same time, because you think, no, surely that kid doesn't hear that, but they probably do hear it from his parents. And then you explain it in a way that's very gentle and kind. In going through the book, there's always, it seemed to be a resurgence of mob violence, mob terrorism against African Americans. And I could only imagine what January 6th must have meant to you, or looked at through your eyes, having seen all of this evidence in this book and seen all the documentation of this. How do you process this? How do you look at today?
Well, I think it's important to know that, like, the stuff that happened on January 6th and this mob violence, I think it's important to be detailed in it and to show the brutality of it, to show how recurring, like, if January 6th, when January 6th happened, a lot of people were shocked because they don't know about the other insurrections in American history, right? So it seems like a one-off crazy thing if you don't know about the Wilmington Massacre, if you don't know about the New Orleans Massacre, if you don't know about how many times that this has happened every time there is progress in America, there is always a step backward. And so this contextualizes it and lets you know, like, I think one of the things about learning history is that whenever something happens, you have a way to contextualize it. But when you ask the question about processing it, it's really interesting to me, because when I read those about the violence that has been enacted against Black people, it always gives me hope. I always think about Black people arriving on the shores of America with nothing, no land, no belongings, not even a language to speak, no one who loves them. And the purpose for them being here was to extract every bit of labor and intellectual property from them, and then for them to die. And in a relatively short period of time, to see the communities and the institutions and the families and the culture and the art that Black people have done, knowing that there is nothing in the history of the world, no violence, no kind of genocide, no antagonism, nothing that hasn't been done to Black people in bulk, and to see where we are now, is the greatest story in the history of the world to me. It is like, I always wonder why we have to whitewash history when America already has the greatest story in the history of the world, with all that violence, with all the massacres, with all the terrorism, to see what this country has as an idea and as a promise, and to see that the people who they've done all that to still believe that they can achieve it just because they live in this country, is a great heroic story. Like, you wouldn't believe it if I wrote it and you didn't know it was true.
It's true.
And that is hopeful to me. It is not sad. It does not make me uncomfortable. We live in a country with the greatest story that has ever been told. But the problem is that that story does not center whiteness as the hero. And that is the pushback. But if we got people to understand that the multiracial coalition that could upend the people who have been preventing the progress for much of this country's time, and if we built the coalition with them, then we could finish that story. Like, the end would be so great. And that is the hope for me. That is the hope for this book. And that is why it doesn't trouble me when I talk about the villain in the story and what the villain did, because I know that there are heroes and I know the ending and we are close to it.
And I love your quote in the book, which when you say, if this country ever truly becomes a post-racial society with liberty and true justice for all, let the history of Black people in America reflect, we were doing it first. And I've always said that we were the ones who delivered the promise of the Constitution. We made white America realize that. As I was reading your book, and this is probably my last question before we take a few questions, your Uncle Junior loved Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I think he called them the elements. Am I right?
Right.
Yes. And you talk about gospel music, you talk about spirituals as you go through the book. And I must admit that I listened to music as I was reading your book some days, and I started out with Harriot Jackson singing How We Got Over, and then I would move to Earth, Wind, and Fire, That's the Way of the World, and then I went on to the Isley Brothers, It's Your Thing, and I ended up stopping at Donnie McClurkin's song where he said, stand. When you've done all you can, you just stand. And I think that that's what African Americans have been doing, standing up for what's right, often dying for what's right. And your book captures that amazing history, that amazing internal optimism and resilience in such both a personal way, so you can laugh when you say this one lady is not Jenny from the auction block, but at the same time, you give it the right context. You give it a history that makes us feel the optimism of what you just said, and the deep belief that's in your soul that this story is the greatest story if it were centered on Blackness, not whiteness.
Yes, I think that is the lesson of the book. I think the lesson of the book is through those characters, through those stories, we learn what it is to be an American, what it is to be Harriet Tubman, is to walk across the East Coast and then turn around and say, I'm going to go get some more people. For Frederick Douglass to escape slavery and say, I want everyone to be free. For people in, who were considered contraband to escape enslavement and said, I want to join the bloodiest conflict in the history of this continent so that I can ensure that everyone is free. That is the history of this country. It is a beautiful story if you really tell the truth.
Yes. And we owe a lot to a lady, I think she was born in Macon, Georgia, who took over the textbooks in America. Mildred, I forget her last name, who was this lady. Rutherford, who one of the daughters of the Confederacy. And she took over the sort of teaching of this by very much following a playbook of getting people on school boards and textbook selection committee, and therefore creating what I call the happy plantation narrative in America. And that so many people absorb that without knowing it and without questioning it. And your book is the truth that puts all of that to rest and gives Black people their equal place on this plane of American history. And I thank you for that. And I think we have time for
Thank you
a couple of
for
questions.
reading it. Sure, let's do it.
Okay.
All right. So I'll moderate some of the Q&A. So our first question is, Michael, thank you for writing this book. What was your research process like?
So I teamed up with a historian who was then the Dean of Africana Studies at North Carolina State University. She's now the Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Blair Kelly, who had a book that came out like a couple of weeks before this one called Black Folk, The History of Working Class America. And what we wanted to do, when you read the book, if you haven't read it yet, it's formatted like a textbook. So we imagined, what if we were actually teaching a class that covered the history of America? How would we separate it into eras? And then we looked at primary sources. We wanted to know what Black people were thinking during this era. So we researched diaries and Black newspapers and Black writers to see what Black people were thinking and writing during each era. And we presented the history of this country as not really a history of Black people as much as it is a history of America from the perspective of Black people, right? And so that's what we wanted to do with this book. And the research process was looking for primary sources and creating what essentially became a syllabus for teaching this history.
One of the great aspects of the book is that at the end of each section, you have an activity, you have a question with answers. Some of them are funny, some of them you have the same 4 answers for each question, and it makes you think. And then you have activities like, imagine a post-racial society. Imagine what it's like to live in this type of neighborhood. And you really stop and think. And I would often share that with people at dinner. I said, let's just do this as an exercise at dinner. And people would be a bit puzzled by it. But ultimately, it led to some good conversation. And that's what I think your book will do. It will make people start to talk and think more broadly. Next question, Anthony.
Right.
So somebody writes, are you planning to offer a class? This is the knowledge we all need right now.
I think this book, it is a template. The book has a template, like it is a template for a class. It sections off history. It has quizzes. I don't know if I have the time. I'm also a full-time working journalist, so I don't know if I have the time to teach a class. But I think you can extract some stuff from this book to use or to inject in a curriculum or to create a curriculum. So, I hope someone would do that. And I still have the curriculum for my course, Race as an Economic Construct.
Thank you. The next question is, those who would benefit from reading this book most likely won't. How can we disseminate the history to those who need it the most?
Well, I think putting this kind of work into putting it to the public is part of that step, right? It's hard to keep telling lies when people can just find the truth, right? Like you can't keep creating a false narrative. Like you can't, like once I learned that 2 + 2 = 4, you can't keep telling me that 2 + 2 = 22, right? Because I know how to do math now. And so I think one of the first steps is to just keep putting the truth out there. A professor that was in that one of my favorite professors used to talk about the necessity of existence, which is that some scholars, some builders would do things just because they needed to exist, right? So a good example is you might be a great, the example is the guy who invented the television set, right? He had a brother-in-law who was not who knew nothing about electronics or anything, but he says, hey, I saw your design and I'm going to go to school and learn how to blow glass tubes. And he just went to school and learned how to go, because he knew he needs some glass tubes for the picture tubes. And so he knew that what he was going to contribute was just something that needed to exist for this other thing to flourish. And so the necessity of existence, of putting the truth out there, is part of the first step.
Oh, thank you. Our next question is, what books are you currently reading?
So right now, I read like a billion things at once. So I'm rereading Negroes with Guns by Robert F. Williams. I just bought Soledad Brothers again this weekend, and I can't think of the name of it. So The Color of Law, I know you may have heard of that, but there's a second part that I just found in a bookstore and I wanted to read that, so I'm digging into it. It's about the economics of segregation and how it influenced America.
Oh, thank you. So our last question is, what's next for Michael Harriot?
Well, after this book tour, I go back to work as a journalist, start working on the next book. And, mostly what I want to do is continue in any way that I can to help people understand the history of this country and contribute to the progress toward equality in any way that I can, whether it's as a history scholar, whether it is as a journalist or just as a storyteller. I want to help people see Black people and to help tell our stories. And I think that's my job here on the earth. And so any way that I can find to do that effectively is the next thing for me.
Thank you. Alvin, Michael, it's been a pleasure hosting you this evening on behalf of the Ferguson Library. I thank you for the history you tell and the work that you do. Michael, I wish you continued success on this very important book. And I thank you both for being with us this evening.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot.